It's 4:40, and we will be done at 3 o'clock, or at least I'm working out right about that time. So we're going to begin with Professor Peterson's presentation on the update of the study that he's done in New York.
So that introduction reminds me of the fact that I was invited to Wisconsin to be an expert witness in a district court hearing where the judge was trying to decide whether or not the participation of religious schools in the program in Wisconsin was constitutional. And I had done this evaluation with Jay Green, where we found that an earlier version of the program, which no longer existed, had worked after 3 to 4 years. And I gave my testimony, and I'm very proud of myself. And the attorney for the other side said, Mr. Peterson, is your testimony objective? And I said, oh, yes. And he said, well, are you the same Mr. Peterson who wrote that the choice people are Jedi fighters fighting against the Death Star? Yeah, well, the judge decided against us. But we prevailed eventually in the Wisconsin Supreme Court because they had not heard my testimony. So out of that experience in Wisconsin, I got so much criticism that I was able to raise a lot of money to do an evaluation of another voucher program. So that's one of the lessons I've learned, that no matter how severely you are criticized for the work that you've done, you know, be like the governor said, just keep marching on. Don't let it put you down, because you get friends just as well as you get enemies along the track you walk. So here I'm going to report on what we did back in 1997 when these students in New York City received the fellowship to go to a private school if they won a lottery. So let's just begin. What I'm going to emphasize today is that many students don't graduate from college. We're looking at the long-term effects of school choice. If you go to college in 4 years, there's a 40% chance that you will get the degree. In 6 years, 60%. African Americans, much less. Hispanic Americans, also low. So just showing you the disparities that you already know and putting some numbers on them. Because getting that BA degree is really a long ways away, and is really something that you cannot count on obtaining. So can a voucher program actually enhance the chances of getting the degree? And as we've talked about again and again, most of the choice program evaluations have not looked at that. In fact, even the greatest choice program evaluation ever undertaken did not look at that, because Chingos was so anxious to get a publication so he could get this fancy job at the Urban Institute that he went out too soon to estimate the attainment of the students in the voucher program. So that's the motivation for this presentation. But I'm also motivated by this passage by William Julius Wilson, who's here at the Kennedy School now, but was an old friend of mine from my days in Chicago. And he always emphasized that we have to have an understanding of the lives that people live that we're talking about. And he says the ghetto features a population, the underclass, we don't dare use that word anymore, but he did, in a book that I published called The Urban Underclass. Couldn't get by with that today. The ghetto features a population, the underclass, whose primary predicament is joblessness, reinforced by growing social isolation. Outmigration has decreased the contact between groups of different class and racial backgrounds, and thereby concentrated the adverse effects of living in impoverished neighborhoods. These concentration effects reflected in the residents' self-limiting social dispositions, notice that passage, are created by inadequate access to jobs and job networks, the lack of involvement in quality schools, the unavailability of suitable marriage partners, and the lack of exposure to informal mainstream social networks and conventional role models. Well, that's a really packed sentence, right? That's a packed passage there. Well, the applicants to the program in New York City that we're going to talk about here were truly disadvantaged. Ignore the last column, that's misleading. But just focus on the first two columns there, and especially notice the BA degree. Only 10% of the students are getting the BA degree at the time that we reported results previously. But more of them have after a few more years. We go back and we look at the data 4 more years later in 2017, and we see that the percent getting the BA degree increases from 10% to 16%, a 60% increase. And for African Americans, the increase is from 7% to 10%, Hispanic Americans 10 to 18%, and for the others, the small group of non-minorities in the sample, from 12 to 25%. Okay, this is the control group. This is not the, we're not looking at all the applicants, we're only looking at those in the control group. So this is the same thing for people who are immigrants and not immigrants. I'm going to pass over that quickly for the lack of time. And this is consistent with the original stimulation for this intervention, which came as a result of an invitation by the Archdiocese of New York. Cardinal O'Connor tells Rudy Crew, the Chancellor of the New York City Public Schools, send me the city's most troubled public school students and I will teach them, right? That get headlines. I mean, that got big time headlines. And Mayor Rudy Giuliani was very enthusiastic about doing this, but opponents said it violated the Constitution. And so what happens instead is that some hedge fund operators who became very close friends of mine, as it turned out, set up this foundation called the School Choice Scholarships Foundation. And they offered half tuition vouchers worth about $2,500 in contemporary, in today's dollars, to 1,000 low-income families. So that happens in 1997. And the fall of that year, they enter grades 1 through 5. You had to be a public school student if you entered 2nd grade, but any student could enter 1st grade. Over 20,000 applicants. Vouchers were given by means of a lottery, because there were only going to be a few thousand handed out. They ended up giving out a little bit more than 1,000. The program eligibility was limited to those eligible to participate in free school lunch. Income was verified before the lottery by Mathematica. Brian's still here. Credit has to be given to them for the care with which they collected all this data at the beginning, because that's what allowed us to connect this information to the National Student Clearinghouse data, which allowed us to attempt to match 99% of the students in the experiment with the college enrollment and attainment data. So we were really able to track these kids. So you don't automatically go to a private school just because you get a voucher, but it did increase the chances of going to a private school by 66 percentage points. The average time spent there was 1.7 years if you were in the treatment group. Okay, so what were the impacts? The original estimate in 2013 and the published data that was released in 2015 was an impact that was positive but very small, 1 percentage point increase in 4-year degree attainment. We now observe that that's increased to 1.6 percentage points. that was not significant, but the impacts on African Americans were substantially greater. Now, this is the benefit of the offer of a voucher. It's not the treatment. We had a lot of discussion about the difference between the offer and the treatment. The treatment effects, that the treatment's effects are those on those who actually take the voucher and make use of it to go to a private school. They're going to be bigger. We're going to talk about them in a minute, but the impact of the voucher increases slightly for African Americans over this 4-year period as they have more time to get their college degree, from 3.7 to 4.8 percentage points. And little increases for other, if you take all the minority groups, I mean, in some sense you could argue you shouldn't be splitting the African Americans and the Hispanics into 2 groups, because there's no statistically significant difference between the African Americans and the Hispanics. Even though the Hispanic effects are not statistically significant, neither are they statistically significantly different from those of the African Americans. So that's why I'm combining them all together. Albert and I, Albert, who wrote this paper with me, somehow your name got left off of the presentation, Albert, but there it is. The minority effects are modest but significant. Okay, so, and we also see this strange thing that immigrants are not, if the mother was born outside the United States, we don't get positive effects. We actually get slightly negative effects that are not significant. But if you're born within the United States, we get significant effects. And once again, we see a little increase between 2013 and 2017. Okay, so we also find a difference between those who were born of families where one of the parents had some college. These are not college graduates. It's not that both parents had the some college exposure, but at least one parent had college exposure received positive effects of 4.5 percentage points. That's quite a bit bigger than we observed in 2013 when we didn't see significant effects, and we're finding negative effects for those who came from families without a college parent in the family, who might be identified as the truly disadvantaged in Bill Wilson's terms. So, translating that into treatment of the treated effects, that is to say the effects of actually going to a private school and scaling it up and saying, okay, how big were these effects? And you go to the bottom line there on the screen, passing over the details, you can see that these are not tiny effects. These are the voting participation rate effects. These are big effects. These are 91% increase in college completion for African Americans. Maybe that's a little exaggerated, but for the minority group, it's a 30% increase in college completion. The college parent, those born of college parents, 40% increase in completion rate. So these are not minor little effects. Now, if you just look at those who are from low-income families, I mean, all these families are low income. They're all eligible for free lunch. But some of the families had no more than $25,000 a year in 2018 dollars, $16,000 a year in contemporary dollars. And some of them came from families where neither parent had ever gone to college. We don't see any significant effects. And there you can see an example of a negative effect on that segment of the applicant pool. So these are minority students or non-immigrant students who come from families who are truly disadvantaged. The kind of people that I think Bill Wilson was talking about. But we see big impacts for those who are just somewhat better off. One of the parents had been to college. The income was above that $25,000 threshold, somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000. So these are, if you go to the bottom line of the effects of treatment are 42%, 68%, 80%, 126. Don't believe any one of these numbers, but these are all big effects in college completion rates. So what do you conclude from this? Well, maybe they just stayed in these private schools for a longer period of time, and you see some examples of that. If the income was higher, then they were more likely to actually make use of the voucher, and they made use of it for a longer period of time. But these are not big differences, so this can't be the whole story. It might be part of the story. So what I would emphasize is that the benefits are concentrated on minorities and non-immigrants who have somewhat more financial and educational resources. That's where you see the payoff. Vouchers have yet to be demonstrated, at least in our research, that they benefit the truly disadvantaged, the kinds of people that Bill Wilson described. But there's a lot of other people living in those same neighborhoods who have significant deprivations, but some resources, who can benefit substantially from this new opportunity. Now that's a thought that I haven't seen considered sufficiently in the discussion of school choice and school vouchers. We always want to emphasize that these things can help the truly disadvantaged, but maybe they are of, maybe it's even more important that they give opportunities to those who are not quite that disadvantaged, but maybe if they're in a public school environment, can't find the resources necessary to accomplish the potential that they actually have. So there are no limitations. And I just said that. So thank you.
Dr. Cheng. Antonio's going to come with us.
Oh, I think I can figure it out.
All right.
I think that's my name on it. Well, I love the Star Wars reference, Paul. I don't have anything like that, but so I'll wish everyone an early Happy Star Wars Day on May the 4th. Yes, sir. All right, anyway, so we're going to wrap up this panel with this other paper's joint work with, so Sam Garrows was a postdoc here. He's no longer with us. He's moved on. Also with Paul and Marty here. And in this paper, we're simply going to take a look at what parents say about charter schools, private schools, their traditional public schools, to get that perspective. I think this has been mentioned a little bit in Pat's session about whether parent perceptions might be better predictors of long-term outcomes. Anyway, let's just take a first cut at figuring out what they do say. Okay, and so just to give you what the kind of headline result is, if you want to kind of rank order the types of schooling sectors that are out there, what you kind of have is private schools being kind of perceived most highly in the highest regard among parents, followed by charter schools, which kind of have ratings by parents that are kind of on par with chosen district schools. So things like open enrollment, a lot of the kinds of schools that we heard Julian Betts talk about earlier this morning. And then kind of coming in there at the end would be kind of your traditional assigned district schools. So let me motivate this a little bit about why we care about parent perceptions. Again, we did talk about this a little bit earlier. To what extent do these capture things that we care about? Well, there's some pretty good evidence out there that parent perceptions do line up with traditional administrative measures. So parent perceptions do line up with value-added scores of teachers, for instance, with measures of student achievement, graduation rates, safety, that kind of thing. But it's also possible that parent perceptions capture things that we don't observe. School climate, we don't really quite measure that at scale either. So maybe there's some useful information about what parents say that's kind of capturing some of those aspects. And again, this proposition that, well, maybe it's possible that parent perceptions capture long-run outcomes that we care about. So there's those possibilities. The other possibility, I know there's some folks that argue that parent satisfaction might be the kind of the ultimate end of choice. Whether we want to kind of maximize the utility of parents. That's another kind of thing that's out there. Let's also come clean. There's criticism about how much we kind of want to rely on parent perceptions. For instance, there's a worry that are parents as well informed as we want them to be? Are they satisfied with the right things? Are there certain social goods that we might worry about? Parents kind of not emphasizing. So I just want to lay that out there. I'm not making any sort of normative claim on any of these, but just to kind of motivate why we're looking at this. I guess Paul put up that big block quote by the great William Julius Wilson. I'm going to flatter a former grad school classmate, Evan Ryan-Smith, by putting a quote on a neat review that he recently did on parent satisfaction and private school choice programs. And so essentially the evidence is overwhelmingly positive on parent satisfaction. If you look at the gold standard random assignment studies where we can kind of tease out causal effects of parent satisfaction from private school choice, that's there. You can look at descriptive, non-causal work, and it's there. And so this research is batting better than I guess what we've seen this morning with Pat's attainment and achievement relationships here. I think Evan reviewed 19 studies and he's batting 19 for 19. So overwhelmingly means all of them. But that said, a lot of these studies are primarily limited to specific programs. And so there's really no kind of national comparisons that are out there. You'll notice that that's a private school. Evan's review was about private school choice programs, kind of leaves out charter schools. And so what we're doing in this paper is teasing out and kind of addressing what we don't know. Okay, so this paper is going to take a look at two nationally representative data sets that have basically parent perceptions on private schools, charter schools, and different types of district-run schools. So let me talk about both of these data sets just to familiarize yourselves with it. So the National Household Education Surveys, the NHES. So this is something that the U.S. Department of Education regularly administers. It's a series of surveys, stretches back to the 1990s. And so we're going to use the 2012 version of this data. And in it, we basically have responses from 17,000 parents in households across the U.S. Okay, and so in this data set, we can identify which parents send their kids to charter schools, private schools, also kind of district choice schools, again, the open enrollment schools, the magnet schools, those kinds of things. And then also your traditionally neighborhood, your district schools that are attended by residential assignment. Okay, and in this data, parents are asked to rate their satisfaction with 5 things about their kind of educational experience. So their kid's school overall, the teacher, academic standards, the order and discipline at the school, and just kind of the general interactions with staff. Okay, and we're going to supplement what we find in the NHES with data that comes from the annual EdNext poll. So this is something we did in the 2016 edition of the poll. So surveyed by knowledge networks as usual, and in this data, so you'll notice it's a little smaller. We've got about 1,500 parents in charter district and private schools. So again, smaller sample, and then you'll notice also we can't disentangle what kind of district school the parents are sending their kids to, whether it's one that's attended because of residential assignment or if it's an open enrollment one. But we do get more detail about what the parents say regarding those schools. So for instance, we ask, again, a list of items for the parents to kind of rate their satisfaction on, so teacher qualities, discipline, character, and values instruction, location, facilities. We also further ask the parents about kind of their perception of how serious certain issues are at the school. So things like fighting, damage to school property, drug use, racial conflict, lack of extracurricular activities. Okay, and then we're also going to supplement that with some information about parents describing how often they engage and interact with just the teachers at their school. Okay, so communication about achievement, schoolwork, homework for their kid, volunteering, behavior, that kind of thing. So I'm going to jump right into the results and kind of just let the data speak for itself. So just some maybe brief description, a brief description of who goes where. First, I guess it's reassuring that if you kind of look across these data sets, they do tell a similar story. So, for instance, maybe this is what we expect to find. So if you look at private schools, for instance, you'll see that the kind of average household income of parents who go to private schools in both data sets is much higher. White families tend to go to private schools at higher rates. In both the data sets, for instance, charter schools tend to be located in urban areas. Okay? So both, it's good news, both data sets at different years over time are kind of telling a similar story. So we can kind of look at these things in conjunction with one another. Okay, so I'm going to show you a series of graphs, and each of these graphs are going to be showing differences in probabilities of selecting the highest response category in each of those surveys. Okay, and we're going to kind of describe differences relative to charter schools. Okay, and then on probabilities, we're going to adjust for differences, different demographic characteristics across parents, and I'll kind of plot the point estimates with the 95% confidence intervals across on both sides of these point estimates. So let's just jump right in. So this is from the U.S. Department of Ed data, the NHES. Okay, and generally the story there. So across the x-axis, we have is each item that we ask parents to kind of rate. So school, teacher, academic standards, etc. And you'll notice the red line kind of floating high up there. So that's kind of indicating that in the sample, parents who send their kids to private schools are 15 percentage points approximately more likely to kind of pick that, the best category, very satisfied with each of those school characteristics relative to parents that send their kids to charter schools. Okay, so higher ratings from parents about their private schools than charter schools. If you look at the green line, those are point estimates in the confidence intervals for the assigned district schools. So these are parents who send their kids to district schools that they're attending because they're assigned to those schools. And so what you'll notice, that zero line again is kind of the average for charter school parents. Each of those green point estimates and the confidence intervals are completely below that zero line. So in other words, charter school parents are rating each of those aspects more favorably than assigned district school parents. Now, when we talk about choice district schools, things open enrollment, magnet schools, and those sorts of things, charter schools actually look on par with those kinds of schools. So essentially, this is kind of the rank ordering, but what we would like to do is to maybe take a deeper dive and kind of turn to the results that the EdNext poll that we have in the EdNext poll. So again, here we have a smaller sample. We don't break out district schools by type, but we do have a wider range of items to kind of tease out what parents are thinking about. So in this data, you'll notice that private school parents still, the probability of being very satisfied with each of the following kind of aspects of their school, certainly higher than the charter school parents. It is a smaller sample, so you see some of the confidence intervals crossing the zero line, so if you care about the statistical significance, it's not there. Do want to emphasize that the point estimate is higher. The one exception is with values instruction. So parents who send their kids to private schools overwhelmingly kind of are very satisfied with kind of the instruction in character and values, which kind of fits with some of the themes that we've heard maybe from David's talk about private schools and their mission and what they emphasize in their schools. District schools again kind of fall in the same order there. If you're thinking about it in terms of rank ordering, with private schools kind of on top, charter schools in the middle, and district schools coming below that. So that's satisfaction on certain aspects of the school. So what if we look at what parents say about kind of the prevalence of problems in school? So these are probabilities of selecting very serious on the scale that we have. So for instance, in that first column, property damage. Okay, and so a way to look at that is essentially district school parents are about 10 percentage points more likely to say that property damage is a very serious problem in their schools relative to charter school parents. Not much difference between charter school parents and private school parents, but we do kind of see this kind of level of seriousness in issues demonstrably there for district school parents. What if we look at kind of the nature of the interactions between school and home? Here we see even fewer differences. If there's anything worth pointing out, so you notice the district school line's a bit lower for achievement and volunteering, the first and third items there. And so it looks like what this means is charter school parents are more likely to have conversations with their teachers about their child's kind of achievement in school and also about volunteering. So maybe it kind of fits with maybe what we maybe hear anecdotally about charter schools, trying to recruit parents to participate in school. Otherwise, there's not much else there. I'll just kind of highlight that I guess private school parents don't talk much, at least relative to charter school parents, regarding schoolwork with their teachers. So those are the results. So let me just kind of summarize again. This is just descriptive, what parents say. So unlike the previous paper, we had lotteries and can kind of describe causal relationships. This is just, think of it as a poll of what parents say. So again, that rank ordering, if you want to think of it that way, you have charter schools kind of in the middle on par with open enrollment and magnet, basically district choice schools. Private school parents kind of having more favorable outlooks of their own schools, with assigned district school parents coming in below charter schools. So that goes for just general satisfaction, goes for certainly with charter schools. And I guess reading that, I didn't emphasize the extracurricular activities finding that we found in charter schools. So I guess I could go back. Not getting the cane show to yank me off here. So one of the things, the interesting things we found with charter schools is that a lack of extracurriculars is actually something that parents kind of consider kind of this issue with charter schools. And so, this again might fit with some of our anecdotal knowledge of charter schools being small. They don't all have their sports teams, or they can't have a wide array of certain programs. So, do want to highlight that in terms of how we can think about what parents are saying holistically about all these schools. And then again, with communications, maybe there's some evidence that communication there is a little more frequent among charter school parents. But again, there's not that much in terms of pronounced differences there. So I'm going to leave it at that and look forward to the discussion we have about what we think about this and where we might think about putting parent perceptions in kind of the grand scheme of all we talked about this afternoon.
Thanks to Paul and Antonio for inviting me to discuss these papers and inviting all of us to be here today and sharing and these wonderful papers. I really enjoy reading these papers. So just as a preview, my name is Emmerich Davies and I'm an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Education. I work on issues of school choice internationally, so I am the odd person in the room. But also just a note to suggest where I'm coming from in my comments. And the second thing, I've been hanging out with a lot of economists recently. I'm not an economist, but they have the habit of presenting discussions with PowerPoints. So if there are any other annoying habits that I have during my presentation, you can blame it on the economists. As I said, I really enjoy reading some of these papers. And so my comments, I'm going to structure them a little bit by starting by just a quick summary of what these papers are about, and then a little bit of why I think these papers are important. And then I want to strike a little note of caution before sort of taking these results out into the world. As I understand it, these are working papers, so hopefully this can be helpful as these papers move ahead. So what these papers are about. Starting with the impacts of school vouchers on college degree attainment and update, looking at the effects of private school vouchers on long-run educational attainment, namely college attendance and attainment, 2-year and 4-year college. And it follows participants in the School Choice Scholarship Foundation program nearly 20 years after they first received the voucher. So this is really long. Right? And the vouchers encourage students to attend private schools in New York. And those that received the vouchers were 66% more likely to attend private schools and likely to attend for about 1 3/4 years longer. So real effects on actual attendance in private schools. So this is encouraging. This is an encouraging first stage. You'd expect to see this with the voucher program, so it's good that we do. But then the update following these students now when they're 26, 27 years old is that for those that spent at least 1 day in a private school, likely thanks to the voucher, low-income minorities are no more likely to receive a 2- or 4-year degree. High-income minorities, 7% more likely to receive a 4-year degree. First-gen college student minorities, no more likely to receive a 2- or 4-year degree. Non-first-gen college student minorities, 10% more likely to receive a 4-year degree. Low-income non-immigrants, no more likely to receive a 2- or 4-year degree. Low-income non-immigrant, 8% more likely to receive a 4-year degree. First-gen non-immigrant, no more likely to receive a 4-year degree. And then non-first-gen college student non-immigrant, 11% more likely to receive a 4-year degree. So I think the paper interprets this cautiously but correctly to highlight the effects, as Paul said, of degrees of disadvantage within this population. And those that are sort of less disadvantaged and have more educational resources within the house and more income within the house are more likely to take advantage of these opportunities. Moving on to the next paper on parental perceptions in charter schools, this paper explores the satisfaction and perceptions of problems with various aspects of schools, including, the data comes from the school, on the schools, and the data comes from the Parent and Family Involvement Education Survey in 2012, and then satisfaction with teachers, satisfaction with standards, order, support, teaching, and this comes from EdNext in 2016, discipline, expectations, safety, values, and location and facilities. And also explores satisfaction and perception of problems with various aspects of the school, including damage, absences, fighting, racial conflict, drugs, extracurriculars, achievement, schoolwork, volunteering, own child's behavior, teaching, and other children's behavior, again, all from EdNext in 2016. So a wide range of opinions on charter, district, and private schools that are explored in this paper. So where do perceptions differ? Parents have more favorable impressions of charter and private schools on all aspects except location and facilities, where district schools are balanced, right? And more mixed results for problems and application. So with that quick refresher, so why are these papers important? Or at least why do I think these papers are important, right? So what is the problem requiring update? This is 20 years since the original voucher program. The scholarship was introduced. And now they're approximately 26 years old. And as Paul pointed out, most low-income students experience delayed and interrupted progression through college. So looking at them at 22 is really stacking the deck of findings that we expect to see anything, right? So looking at these students when they're 26, 27, later stage in life, we're more likely to see effects on college degree attendance and college attainment. So it's really exciting to actually be able to follow and track, and they do a fantastic job matching these students over time. For looking at the parental perceptions of charter schools, I'll let the authors in the paper speak for itself for why this is important. Numerous school districts now include the results of parent satisfaction surveys in school report cards and grading system. ESSA requires that states incorporate at least one metric of school quality other than student success, other than test board performance, into their school accountability systems. So this might be incorporated into measures of school quality, into school success in the future, so it's important that we understand how these might differ. So what should we care about? Test scores? I am quite partial to the idea that these papers put forward that we should care about more than just test scores: attainment, labor market outcomes, graduating from college, reduction in inequality. What we care about with school choice and voucher programs is really what happens much later in life, not only what happens in schools, right? And these papers and this conference in general is just a laser sharp focus on these outcomes. But first, before we sort of take this out into the wild, I do want to strike a note of caution, and I'm going to do this through two specific examples from the paper that I hope make a larger point of the caution I want to share. So a refresher on the update. Again, these are the results that are significant, but I want to highlight a couple of things, right? So for the ascriptive identities that are time invariant, or that are unlikely to change as a result of the voucher, these are those, right? And we see either not significant results or results at 10% more likely and 11% more likely to attain a 2 or 4 year degree, right? These are from the subgroups that are unlikely to change over time. For the subgroups that are likely to change over time and are likely to change as a result of receiving a $1,000 scholarship, you also see a mix of significant and non-significant. And it's these time-variant qualities that I want to focus on right now, right? So, so if you think about a mental model in your head, where these are all low-income households, but some have a little bit more financial resources than others. For the ones that have a little bit more financial resources, at the margins, you can think of a mental model in which the decision they're making is either I make some human capital investment in my children, whether that is buying a better health insurance plan, seeking out private tuition, seeking out after-school activities, or sending my child to private schools, and I have the money, but I can only do one or the other. If I am given a private school voucher, now I don't have to spend the money on private schools. I can send my kids to all these other things and make all these other investments that I would have liked to make, but I couldn't because I was budget constrained. This voucher removes that budget constraint from these children, right? So a quick fix is show us that nothing else changes with the voucher. Show us the only channel was actually just a larger propensity to send your children to private schools. Your income didn't change, or other forms of behavior around human capital investment didn't change, right? And then for the parental perceptions on charter, district, and private schools, there are large differences in satisfaction between charters and assigned district schools on things like standards in order. This comes out of figure 1 on page 34. But there are no differences in satisfaction between charters and district schools on satisfaction of location, facilities, and communication about their own child's behavior and teaching. So off the top, I don't know what to make about these discrepancies, right? So what if 95% of charter parents are satisfied with performance and standards in order, and there are differences between satisfaction between district schools and charter parents? Well, if 95% are satisfied and 85% of district parents are satisfied, I don't know how much we should care about that. But if only 5% of charter parents are satisfied with location of facilities, communications about their own child's behavior, and there are no differences between charter and district schools, we should care about this, right? But they're doing just as horribly as each other. So a quick fix, just give us the mean levels of satisfaction. Tell us what our expectations should be and how much it should change as a result. So the larger point I want to make is I would have liked to see a little bit more structuring of our thinking around these issues, right? So we can better inform policy. For the update, if the channel is directly through the voucher, great. The policy solution is providing a private school voucher. But if the channel is through freeing up budget constraints for other expenditures of human capital, well, so why a private school voucher? Why the soft paternalism? Why the reduction in choice, actually? Why not just give people $1,000 and tell them, spend it as you wish? And trust that they're going to make the correct decision with the additional money. Why force them to have to use this money for schools? And on the opinion of charter schools, so do all opinions matter equally? Do we care about parental perceptions equally on all issues? Or some opinions more important than others? Do some investments and some communications from schools matter more than others? So with that, I think I'm almost out of time. Thank you again. I really, really enjoyed discussing these papers.
I'd like to just start by saying thank you to Paul as well, and Antonia. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Stergios from Pioneer Institute, and a couple things I just want to say. Our panel is great, but not as fun as Robert Pindicios, because he actually said that good civics is like good pornography. It makes me wonder why the kids are not interested. I'm actually trained as an economist, and I don't have a PowerPoint. So let me just take the papers in order. I'm going to just ask some questions that I think are worth some discussion. First one is, I guess, a little commentary. One is that I really appreciated, Paul, your paper in terms of kind of giving me a greater appreciation, a reminder as to where we are in terms of recent studies and past studies, and that the recent studies are more mixed. It's a good reminder sometimes in my business where we're playing an advocate's role. That's extremely important. Second thing is, I'd really be interested if there's any way to unpack, given that the average time that students spent in the voucher-related program was short, what drove that? If there's any way to get at that sort of information. And it obviously has obvious, you could pick them off the top of your head, would be really important given the fact that through heterogeneity analyses, we figured out for whom it really worked better or it didn't work for. It would be important to understand if that was an economic issue or what was driving that, because we do understand through your study much better who it's working really well for and who it's not working as well for. And I'd say that just in terms of Emmerich's last point about informing better policy, I think that analysis that you provided does allow us to do quite a bit of that. It's a little disappointing to those of us who actually thought it could help out the bottom 10% that truly disadvantaged, according to Dr. Wilson. But I think it's really important to inform our view of vouchers. A couple of other things I wanted to point out. I do take the point that these are sizable differences, but I guess this is maybe an expression of my own impatience, having worked in this field for a number of years. I would remind us that we do have some programs out there like Duet, which is Match Beyond before, which has, at least on early data, really tremendous college completion rates. We do have, even in the Boston Public Schools, if you take a look at a recent study from Anguist, Cody's, Janarski, and Walters, that the BPS has an enrollment rate of about 56% of its students. I just say, I'm not challenging the report in terms of its sizable outcomes. It's just that, man, I wish they were bigger. Yes, and that's probably not a helpful comment. I would also note there are programs like the Medco desegregation program here in Massachusetts, which is the historic 52-year-old desegregation program that has college enrollment rates of approaching 90%. So when we think about policy outcomes that we want, and I know enrollment's not the end game, I take the point, and I really appreciate all of the papers that have been presented that are really about, yes, some test scores, taking your point, Emmerich, but about a longer-term view of this. What are the long-term impacts? I would just note that we do have a number of tools out there, and as we look at the voucher programs, and as we look at everything, we have to be brutal in self-reflecting on what is working really well, what's not working well, who it's working for, and I appreciate that deeply in your paper. Albert, on the paper, you have a lot of co-authors, so I was going to point the questions at you. And again, I come to this, I think, is I'm enough of a dweeb to have a PhD, and I'm enough of a practical person to run a school, enough of a practical person to, through Jamie Gass's great work at Pioneer, about 150 different studies on school choice, charters, all kinds of stuff like that. I'm a realist on these things, and I have a number of questions that are around that as relates to the survey. So let me go to the positives, I think, first. I think I took away great solace, great relief from seeing a 30% increase in the number of kids in charter schools, and satisfaction rates aren't going down. That's a great thing, right? The overall shift to Western states, we knew it, but I think you helped to understand that quite a bit better. And I'm really happy to see that satisfaction rates hold largely by demographic groups and income and racial difference. I think those are all really great outcomes. Another thing that I think is really great that comes out of it is if you take a look at problems in the schools, racial conflict is a place where charter schools are playing really well. And in our day and age, that's an awesome thing. I was really surprised to see there was no statistical difference between district and charter schools on quality of learning and schoolwork. The communication around that surprised the heck out of me. Given our schools, and it might just be because our schools are maybe a little different here, we're all over, I shouldn't say we, the charter school sector is all over projecting we have great teachers, we have great teachers. Did I tell you we have great teachers? We do. A couple of other points in here I get to a quibble, and this is a quibble. I see the great utility of surveys. I mean, if you're running a school, you're going to survey your people repeatedly, especially around strategic initiatives. You're trying to change something in a school, you're going to do it at the start of the year, do one at the end of the year, make sure you get it. As a parent, I take the goal line from my perspective as a Syrian and Greek dad is you better survey me because my opinion matters more than yours does. So I get all of that. But I guess there are a couple of lines in the paper, let me see if I can dig them out. Page 7. Understanding how perceptions of satisfaction vary across school sectors can shed light on the different pressures that these sectors are likely to face. Got it? Satisfaction, this is on page 20. Differences in satisfaction across sectors that we have documented may have political consequences. That's where my big quibble is going to be. And on page 21, satisfaction is positively correlated with support for charter formation among charter school parents, whether or not controls are used in the estimation. So my point to make is where there is market share, I think those statements are true. And when there's not market share, those statements are likely not true. So the charter parent satisfaction is not sufficient to creating a political force or creating political will until it is. And I would say I'm not trying to talk about Massachusetts experience. We've heard a lot about that. But we have some of the highest satisfaction rates around. And I think we're a good bellwether for the limitations on that. This is the larger point I want to make. Those of us who work on school choice and work on how the heck do you get out of the bottom 20% to have social mobility, because that's the gold standard for what we're trying to do here essentially, right? We sometimes think that the morality of our position translates into the morality that other people should have. And therefore, obviously there's politics there that will follow us if we just give them really good numbers and some good performance. I think we have to dispense with the view for most parts of the country that the charter school movement is a popular movement. And again, I do not say that simply because of what happened here in Massachusetts. By the way, that was largely because of a badly run campaign. It was a dumb idea and a bunch of other things. So let me continue with just a couple other points on this in this vein. I think a really interesting survey, and you have done a lot of this at Next and otherwise, is understanding what parents in district schools think about charter schools. It helps us understand what are the things we need to talk about in order to convince more people. They are the blockage. I mean, at the end of the day, parents are really focused on their own kids. And there are some limitations built in there, even in terms of previous attempts to build the charter school movement into a popular movement, such as the parents on wait lists, they're going to be with us too, and they're going to show up at the State House and put pressure. It does not happen. Once they don't get into a charter school, guess what they're thinking about? Where's my kid going to get in? That's what they care about. So the limitations of charters are huge. And I would suggest this focus possibly on surveying people outside the charter school world about charter schools, simply because we've seen a lessening in support broadly for charter schools. All this speaks to what I see as the future of charter schools. It's what Governor Sununu said, and that is keep your head down, clean up the charter school movement of those schools that are not performing well, continue to increase the number of charter school students by 1.3 million a year for the past 5 years or so. If we continue on that path, you get to about 10 million kids in charter schools, and 1.3 million over 5 years, excuse me. You get to about 10 million kids in charter schools by 2030 by keeping your head down, doing your hard work. The Hail Mary approach does not work. It may work with donors, but it is not the right approach. Final point. What is extremely important, it comes out in your paper, is you outline the amount of school choice there actually is out there. And it is always amazing to me that desegregation programs aren't talking to charter schools, are not talking to Catholic schools, are not talking, there is a fissure in all these, and as researchers, we could do more to bring those, to facilitate those conversations, bundling research about all of them. Obviously, there are severe limitations to that, but if the conversation doesn't start through research and actual rational conversation, it's not going to start anywhere. That's what that is. Well,
thank you to Jim and Emmerich for their responses. I'm going to give the two authors a quick chance, brief chance to respond to any of the points that Jim or Emmerich raised that you might want to talk about.
No, the points are well taken. I appreciate it. I mean, it's great.
Fantastic. Let's start taking some questions here. We'll go with Dr. Poole.
So, Elder, first of all, who provided you with your Jedi training? Seriously.
I'm kind of like Ray, you just kind of force balance.
Self-manifest.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I'm getting Heisman all over. So, I thought, actually one of the most interesting findings from your study was the one you missed the first time through, and that is the extracurriculars one. Because, the interpretation of that is that there's no difference in satisfaction for charter parents than district and private school parents, even though we know there are much fewer extracurriculars offered. So that suggests that parents basically are rationalizing. They're saying, I didn't choose this school for lots of extracurriculars, so I'm satisfied, I'm reasonably satisfied with the small number there. That they're sort of making those psychological adjustments based, in a very Bayesian sort of way, based on what their knowledge and expectations of the sectors are.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I guess when we see, satisfaction, the thought that comes to mind is, I don't drink soda much. But so if you ask me to, do consumer survey about, Coke and its taste, of course you're going to see no differences between me and between water and Coke, just because I'm selecting on different things. So I think this does raise a broader point, and I think Emmerich was getting to this about, how do we weigh all this information? Parents are rating schools on a ton of things. Which one do we prioritize more? Which one do we prioritize less? And I think this issue that Pat's bringing up is, well, if they prefer different things to begin with, all the comparisons across the different aspects that we want to make are actually, maybe they're not apples to apples comparisons.
Yes.
Yeah, just another comment. Emmerich raised a very good point that the mean satisfaction level would be good to know how significant these differences are. And between very satisfied and all the other alternatives, satisfied, neither dissatisfied or satisfied, dissatisfied, very dissatisfied, it's about split. The samples, that's why we picked the very satisfied option, because it splits the sample roughly in half. So it varies from one item to the next, but you're not talking about 5% of the distribution or 90% of the distribution. We're talking about the changes that are occurring about the middle of the distribution. But I think there's another finding in the data there that the private school world needs to think about, and that is that charter schools reduce the difference in satisfaction between the public sphere and the private sphere by about 1/2. If you sort of look at all that data taken together, you see that the charter schools are about in the middle and about split the difference between the assigned district schools and the private sector. And charter schools are free, and private schools cost a lot of money. So don't charter schools have the potential of undermining the private sector? I think that's also implied by some of these results.
Yes.
Just on that point, I would actually argue the charter schools have undermined the Catholic school sector here in Boston, because why go to Catholic school when you can get pretty traditional, standard, solid education at a free charter school? But maybe I'm misunderstanding the study about the satisfaction on private schools. I think most people who go to charter schools have had experience in a district school and for whatever reason then choose to go to charter school. With the private school satisfaction, how many of those parents have actually been exposed to public schools? And I only ask that because most of the people I know here in Boston that send the kids to private school were private school people from the get-go, and they were going to private school, never even visited.
Well, we don't have that in our data set, but from other data sets, I think we do know that there's quite a bit of migration across sectors My family's not the only family that's been to both the public and the private sector at some point in their lives. So, yeah, I think, and then of course there's lots of communication between friends and neighbors about schools and so forth. So I think people, when they're making a choice, they're making an informed choice between sectors as well as among schools, but they're quite willing to move from one sector or another for a particular school. Oh, yeah, I think the Catholic schools in Boston do have to worry about this growing charter sector. And we see private sector enrollments declining over the last 5 to 10 years. There's been a noticeable decline in the size of the private sector.
Go ahead.
Just to add something, so Evan Reinstein's review that I mentioned, so those were all studies of private school choice programs. So think, DC, right? So these are parents that were in public school going into private school. So, so if you believe that, you do, I guess you get parents that have exposure to both sectors, and the ones that win the voucher to get in, they have higher ratings. But, again, that's, take it for what it says.
Let me go back to one major point that was made in the New York paper, and that was this distinction between what was called the truly disadvantaged and the somewhat less disadvantaged. Besides the fact that there's an income difference, a slight income difference, and a slight educational attainment difference for parents, are there any other factors that you think made one group so much more likely to derive benefits from a voucher than the other group? And is that tied to another point made in a different part of the paper about scholarship size? Because these were actually relatively small scholarships that were being offered.
Yeah, I wish we had that kind of information, and there may be opportunities to do work with the data set to see if there's any other signals in there, like you're suggesting. In my own thinking about it, I think that these income and education variables that we're relying on here are indicators of something more important than income and education, but that's what we have. These are, but we know that those are just, they're highly correlated with lots of other things that are probably much more important, but what we can't tap into. So, yeah, I think that you've got to, I like the Wilson quotation because it points to all of the forces that are at work there that might be affecting the differences between, and we also know that low-income neighborhoods have a lot of different kinds of people living within them. And I always feel like the people who live in a neighborhood where the debilitating forces are powerful, there's a lot of violence on the streets, and a lot of other deprivations that you have to suffer with, that there's some people who are really holding it together and really trying hard. And if they get an opportunity to place their child in a different setting, that might be big time for them. Now, maybe you could get the same effect by giving them that $1,500 without the voucher, but we don't know that. And what we do know from this data is that if they get the voucher and they make use of the voucher, there are long-term benefits from a very small intervention. I mean, I should have mentioned that more in the presentation. This is a very small intervention. It's a half tuition scholarship for 3 years. So, 1.7, they don't even make use of it for 3 years on average. Some of them do, and it should also be said that if you use it for all 3 years, even though the initial promise was just for 3 years, those hedge fund guys had too soft a heart to just throw them out on the streets at the end of the 3 years. So if you kept using that voucher, you could use it through 8th grade. They came up with the additional resources somehow out of their back $1 billion pocket. You can let them go on for a few more years. So actually, it is a little bit longer than what we're suggesting there on the part of at least some people. So, yeah, that's something that's in the original paper that still has to be tightened down for the version that we have here.
Darrell.
Yeah, just a sort of a political question about who the voucher program worked for versus who it didn't work for. It seems like it worked for, and I say this totally tongue-in-cheek, rich poor kids, not poor kids. I am concerned that someone would say that that means it failed, not that it worked for people that you hadn't suspected, and that potentially another intervention is needed for for the families that are cited in the Wilson quote. Thoughts on that?
Oh, of course that will be used. I mean, because it's a standard thing about, okay, so vouchers or charters only help some. They help the families that are willing to show the energy necessary to make a choice of school, but how about the kids who are left behind? And so, yeah, but my view of it is, I don't know how to sell this politically, is that if you help those who want the help and can use the help, you have done something.
I think we have room for one last question, yes.
Yeah, on the parent survey work, which is really interesting, I always worry that two parents look at the same school come up with totally different views. In either of these surveys, were parents interviewed about all the schools that their various children were attending, so that you could actually do a within family comparison of what people were thinking about charters versus traditional public and so on?
So short answer is no, but it's a good idea, and we should do it.
All right, great. I'm going to give Dr. Peterson a chance here to wrap this up, because I believe that we are just before 3 o'clock. All right.
Well,
I shouldn't
what
want to
can
wrap
be
up and
said?
thank people, right?
What can be said?
Thanks.
You know, this has been really illuminating because we've had so many different papers looking at the same topic from so many different angles. And so even those of us who have read a lot about this material, it's really helpful to see this all juxtaposed. And I suppose we walk out the door as humble, as not even more humble than we were walking into the door. So thank you all for coming.